Welcome back to the Skylanders Ultimate Nightmare series, where I will play a solo run with every Skylander on Nightmare mode to see which Skylanders and which of their upgrade paths are the best. First run today, we've got Stump Smash on the Nut Crafter upgrade path. Here we get the ability for our acorns to explode, which grows plants on nearby enemies. When facing the Mega Nut, you can attack it to make it burst into a bunch of acorns that scatter out, and when you spit acorns, you can spit up 2 nuts at once. The Soul Gem you get from Series 2 Stump Smash is also really powerful. You can hold down the attack button to rapidly spit out a series of nuts. It allows you to shoot out up to 5 waves of nuts at a time, so combined with the shooting 2 at once, you can get 10 in a single burst. And these guys can roll pretty far, not to mention if they hit an enemy, they explode for a big area effect thanks to the upgrade Pollen Plume. Something extremely helpful for Stump Smash is the fact that enemies will sometimes target the Mega Nut, the acorn, or even the sprouts that grow on them when they get hit by an acorn. So most of the time, if you have projectiles on the field, they're not even going to attempt to attack you, and they'll just chase down your other objects. Now, Stump Smash has a ton of amazing upgrades, but one upgrade that is not particularly good is the Soul Gem from Spyro's Adventure. It allows Stump Smash to float in water and regain his health, which is, as you can imagine, fantastic in a game that has no water. The upgrade tree doesn't actually mention what the saplings that attach to enemies do, but if you nut towards an enemy, a plant will bloom, which causes them to move slower. Their attack speed is not at all affected, it's only their walking speed, so not quite as useful as you might hope it is, but it is still a welcome addition. If you drop a Mega Nut on the ground and decide to make it burst by smashing it, the nuts are going to fly in every which direction. Those acorns are going to travel much faster than Stump Smash himself can normally spit them out. But it's a little harder to aim, so the nuts are going to go out of control and go everywhere. It's still very helpful, but oftentimes it'll just be better to use the standard double nut. Most enemies in this game have pretty low health, so they can't really handle the double nut. Now, I've been talking up the nuts a lot, and they're definitely the star of the show on the Nut Crafter upgrade path. But Stump Smash's smashing abilities are actually still pretty powerful. In many situations, you'll find yourself realizing that nutting is definitely not the appropriate move, namely if the enemy is right in front of you. In that case, you can pulverize the enemy with Stump Smash's hammer move, which still does fantastic damage, because its damage doesn't actually get increased on the other upgrade path. In particular, the primary combo is perfect for smashing your enemies. Whether or not they like it, they're going to be eating 90 damage to the face. Some of the enemies, like the executioners, get laser focused on your nuts, so they're going to always target the nut instead of you, which causes them to go a bit wild and spin and teleport everywhere, where normally the strategy with a projectile is to stand back, have them throw the axe at you, and miss. In Chapter 6, you can sometimes nut on these Archean jousters before they're expecting it by leaning up on the slope, but you gotta be careful of them turning around to hit you, because not many people appreciate taking a nut from behind without expecting it. One technique I like to use is called the nut block. The bark demons will launch a projectile through the ground at you, but if it runs into one of your acorns, it'll actually stop the attack prematurely. One weakness with Stump Smash is that sometimes he can't deal with too many guys on top of him at once. His hammer slam can only hit so far in front of him, but the acorns actually have a pretty good burst range. Now, if you ever get caught off guard with Stump Smash and take a hit, he does have an ability to shoot out thorns at all the enemies nearby. And while not the most useful on Nightmare mode where you really don't want to be taking hits, it is at least something to get enemies off of you. An interesting tactic could be to walk into those cactus hazards on purpose, because they'll only deal single-digit damage, but you'll get the opportunity to use Thorn Bark and launch thorns out everywhere. Now, when I mentioned the acorn was good, I wasn't kidding. Look at how many guys you can nut down at once. And some of these enemies can't even move, so they just have to sit there and take it. The ChompyBot 9000 took quite a long time as per usual, but all you've got to do is be patient and dance around the fact that you both know he's just going to get smashed at the end of the day. At the hilly section of the level, the nuts tend to like sliding right down the hill towards the middle, so you've got to be careful not to miss. But if you perform well, you can even hit this grenade general from up on that ledge. These nut blocking enemies are quite hard to get around. As you might imagine, you have to get to them from behind while they're not expecting it, but they'll do whatever they can to make sure you don't nut on them, so you've got to be sneaky about it. The ending of this level is not too much easier either. There's tons of inhuman shields trying to block the ChompyBot 9000 from getting hit by my acorns, and they do a pretty good job at it too. Early on in Chapter 9, I noticed there was this floating pot that was slowly moving off to the side on its own, and that's probably not nearly the weirdest thing you've heard so far in this video. Normally for the Troll Stomper, I'll advise hiding behind this rock, but Stump Smash's onslaught of auto-launching nuts combined with the Elemental Zone ends up being too much for this enemy to handle, and they go down quickly before I take too much damage. The throne room is usually pretty difficult, but for Stump Smash it was kinda just more of the same. Just circle around the fountain and look for opportunities to nut, while making sure to dodge the explosions of the grenade generals. The arena at the end of the level restricts your access sometimes to some parts of the area. Having only projectiles that will fall off the edge makes it difficult to look for opportunities to take these guys out. This area was actually super hard. Except for at the end. The Jawbreaker enemy became a nutcracker because apparently all he knew how to do was target and track down my nuts. He'll be so distracted by the acorns that you can basically do whatever you want and ignore him the entire time, giving you ample amount of time to take out all the other enemies that are trying to get in the way. And once he's the only one left standing, taking him down becomes trivial. Aerial attack introduces more ghostly and more armored enemies, which makes it a little bit more difficult to penetrate through. The armor increases how many hits they can take, and the ghostliness just makes them slightly more difficult to see. A lot of the time it comes down to being able to dodge and survive while you wait for the bag of boom to throw bombs into the arena, because then you can just throw the bombs at the enemies to take them down quick. And what better way to distract the enemies than to spit up a bunch of nuts all at once? Even this part of the level, which is probably the hardest part, because it has tons of waves of strong enemies all at once, doesn't stand a chance to the Smash Master. Enemies just can't seem to get enough of Stump Smash's acorn abilities, and make it their life's mission to destroy them. The end of the level does have some Drow archers which are just out of reach, but it ends up not being too bad. When using the auto nuts attack to rapid fire nuts as fast as you can, there is one thing you gotta look out for, and that's the fact that they don't travel perfectly straight. It spreads out two columns of nuts, one to your slight right and one to your slight left. So if an enemy is standing right in front of you at a range, you can sometimes nut on both sides of them without hitting him at all. The solution is as simple as just turning to the side slightly, but it is something you have to make note of. If you're going to spend your time spitting up nuts after all, you're going to want them to do something. Nothing worse than a wasted nut. Speaking of, for some reason the limit on the amount of nuts you can have on the board at once is 7. So occasionally, if you're spitting out maximum nut capacity at long range, they're going to disappear before hitting their target. But if you're standing up really close to an enemy, you can actually hit the same guy with 2 different nuts at once, which is interesting because most multi-shot moves can't do that. Spyro's triple shot fireballs and Gilgrunt's triple shot harpoons, for example, cannot hit the same enemy with more than one of the projectiles. No matter how close you stand, you only can hit one fireball on the same guy at once, but Stump Smash does not have that limitation, which is fantastic. Armored Mohawk Cyclopses in particular are a bit tricky for Stump Smash because you can't prevent them from moving just by attacking them all the time. The Slobbering Mudicus, though, is another giant enemy who is apparently terrified of your acorns and will target them more often than anything else, leading to a pretty simple and effective plan of attack in order to counter them. Apparently these guys have got nuts in their eyes because that's all they can see. Not even the Cyclops Rider can knock some sense into them. These guys are drooling over my nuts. The Chapter 12 arena can be pretty tricky as any character because they restrict your movement a lot. As long as you make sure to keep some distance from some of the scarier enemies so they can't approach you, then you should be good. It is also worth noting that you can stand in the outsides even though there's blades coming. You just gotta be pretty cognizant of when they're gonna come around. But don't think the entire outer ring is off limits. You can definitely stand there safely most of the time. There's nothing wrong with needing to take a break from the action every now and again. While not improving the difficulty too much, this Chompy Bot is in a bit of an awkward position on this cliffside. It makes it a little bit harder to run around him and dodge attacks. but the Life Elemental Zone sure does help circumvent that problem. As well as the Blaster Trolls immediately blowing themselves up, that definitely helps. If you're persistent enough, you can convince these Archean duelists to jump into the laser beam by just shoving a couple nuts in their face. The force of impact of each nut will push them back a little bit until it's too late. But Archean duelists without any sort of laser beam to bail us out become really threatening. They will attempt to lunge straight at you with no warning. It was a little too much for me to handle if I'm being honest, so my strategy was to take them on one by leading them down the ramp so I can fight them individually. The second wave became much easier when I was able to actually see them. Unfortunately, not every problem can be solved by smashing, so eventually in the level I became too overwhelmed and Stump Smash couldn't last any longer. But getting near the end of Chapter 14 is more than enough to get Stump Smash into what is currently first place on the leaderboards. Next up, we're going to take a look at Stump Smash on the Smash and Bash upgrade path. Here we are granted 2 more combos. The secondary combo will charge forward while hitting enemies multiple times, and the tertiary combo will spin around to hopefully hit several at once. You can also shoot a Mega Nut forwards by standing next to it and pushing it, or you can smash a Mega Nut to make it explode. The Mega Nut Smash is quite inferior to the version you get on the other upgrade path, which will shoot out acorns when you smash it, simply because the acorns are so much more useful than a small one-time explosion. It can be useful, but is usually just gonna take too long to set up, and it would be worth it if that first hit of the hammer could lead to a combo, but for some reason if you smash a nut you cannot transition into a combo right after. The Acorn Croquet attack, where you launch an acorn forwards by pushing it, is actually kind of nice, if not just for the fact that you're lacking a good projectile because you no longer have double nut, and the auto-firing nut is much worse when they don't have the explosion of the Pollen Plume upgrade. It actually does do a fantastic job at pushing enemies, it just doesn't do quite as much of anything else. It's got less damage, less explosion radius, doesn't grow plants on enemies, and also the sheer number of acorns you can get just creates so many distractions. And as for the combos, the charging forwards attack is pretty good at damaging one enemy several times in a row, but it does leave you a bit vulnerable as you cannot turn while performing it. The spin combo is not particularly great because you can only hit each enemy once during the move. If you wanted an attack that could hit several enemies, then you probably should just double nut. Overall, Stump Smash's primary combo is probably his best one, just because it does a really good amount of damage, so there's not much reason to even use the other two. The Acorn Croquet upgrade is actually fantastic for knocking enemies over the edge. Something that's really interesting though is that the acorns and the nuts will still cause enemies to grow plants, even though that upgrade is supposed to be locked behind the Nutcrafter upgrade path. Even though you're technically getting an extra upgrade on this path by being able to grow plants with the acorns and the nuts, this upgrade path is obviously inferior. Stump Smash's Auto Nuts Soul Gem is incredibly powerful if you haven't noticed so far, and if you combine that with the fact that you can shoot 2 nuts at once on Nutcrafter, it just gets out of hand. And a bit more subtly but still incredibly impactful, the acorns actually have an explosion radius on Nutcrafter, where with Smash and Bash, I find myself shooting out an acorn at an enemy right in front of me and it doesn't hit them. Or I'll shoot it out at 2 enemies at a distance and it somehow only hits one of them. A double nut is something you just don't forego, and nothing on this upgrade path is really a worthwhile replacement. Even without that upgrade path, Stump Smash is quite formidable, but he will just become a monster if you do have all that power. The main thing this character probably lacks is a mobility move. The secondary combo does bring you forwards a little bit, but it kind of fails as a mobility move because you have to spend time using the hammer twice in order to set it up, not to mention that you can't turn while using it. So if you need a quick option to escape an enemy, the Stump Fist charge is not going to be it. The small downside of having nuts on the field causing the executioners to spin out all the time actually gets really amplified if the nuts aren't carrying their own weight. These guys will teleport everywhere and you have very little in order to deal with them. Having fewer reliable projectiles makes the armored Mohawk Cyclopses quite a bit more of an issue than they were before. You can't just go smashing in whenever you feel like it, you've got to wait for them to calm down, and without a good projectile they can quite easily overwhelm you a lot of the time. Overall, I had a ton of fun smashing my way through Skylands with these 2 Stump Smash runs. I do wish Stump Smash were a little less talkative, because every 5 seconds when I was spewing out nuts, I felt like he was doing his weird laugh. That sound effect will now forever be burned into my memory. Anyways, Nutcrafter is definitely the way to go. Thanks for tuning in to my longest and hardest video yet. It took several hours to record just because of how far Stump Smash made it, and it took several more hours to edit it, so props to you if you were able to make it through the whole thing.